The State Department, as you just heard, says Russian forces are committing war crimes in Ukraine. What could explain President Vladimir Putin's actions? John Sipher served in the CIA's clandestine services and ran the CIA's Russia operations. He's also an author and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He joins us now from Washington. Mr. Sipher, nice to meet you. Thank you very much for making the time. Can you hear me, sir?
I can, yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to start off by asking you, based on your experience in Russia, your knowledge of Vladimir Putin, does the audacity of the assault, the targeting of civilians, surprise you at all?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, it's sort of the Russian way of war. And there's a number of experiences, even in recent history, in Grozny and in Chechnya and in Syria and even before that, where the sort of happy assumptions that they would go in and there'd be a puppet government and it would be easy to win proved not to be true. And when they found resistance, they doubled down and essentially, engaged in mass murder using artillery and airplanes and bombing. And so it says it is, it's really not that surprising.
And do you see what you just outlined as evocative of what's happening now? And by that, I mean the Ukrainian resistance, by many accounts, is stronger than Putin had anticipated. And hence you see the mass murder of civilians.
Yeah, so, it often happens, I think, with dictators that are in power for so long is they have their view of the world and nobody wants to challenge it. Nobody wants to tell them they're wrong. And so he's had this sort of strange messianic view of a greater Russia and Ukraine's role and having vassal states on his borders. And I think he believed, and, all evidence from our intelligence community and others say that they truly believed that it would take 1 or 2 days or more to get into Kiev and they'd put in a puppet government. And people would sort of welcome them with open arms, Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine. It turned out not to be the case. And so now a strong man is showing himself not to be so strong on the world stage. And so he has to do something to reclaim his sort of place. And the way to do that is to double down and use violence.
And what are the implications more long-term of that mindset? And by that, I mean, are we looking at, a drawn-out situation where there's no way he will ever relent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of that's going to depend on the circumstances of his army and if there's defections and if there's political pressure at home. And so at some point, you'd hope to think that he would find a way to manufacture a story, a narrative of victory. He manufactured the entire reason to start this war. There was no threat from Ukraine. There was no threat from NATO. Ukraine was not about to join NATO. So he created a false pretense to go in. So he's going to have to create some sort of pretense to eventually get himself out. But I do think that, Western and NATO services now suspect that this may be a longer war than we originally anticipated.
And what about the maybe unintended consequence of what we're about to see in the next 24 hours, for example, in Brussels, this kind of incredibly unified front from the West, from NATO, and an increasing presence of NATO troops, for example, there now, we've heard from Jens Stoltenberg, for the long term. How might that play into his mindset as well? Yeah,
well, he's had this sort of paranoid sense that he believes that he's the victim here, and there's efforts to sort of overthrow Russia, all of which is nonsense and not true. And so I think one thing that will come of this is he will take this to try to tell his people that the threat is not so much from Ukraine and Nazis, quote unquote Nazis in Ukraine and such, but that NATO has designs on Russia, and NATO is increasing its troops in Europe, and this is a threat to Russia, and it's a much larger threat. So I think he will amplify the issue, amplify the threats, amplify his intimidation and threats outwards, and use it as a straw man with his own people. So I think he will use that to his best effect.
I know it's difficult to kind of get a sense at this point in time, but when you were in Russia, how receptive are Russians to the message that he puts out there, however fake it might be?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that in our own country, right? So it's not hard to follow sort of a simple narrative, a fake narrative that's out there. And so, yeah, a lot of his people, they want to trust their government. They want to trust their country. They've been fed for a long time these sort of lies and sort of historical simplicities about Ukraine, and then it's one country with Russia and all of these type of things. And so it'll be very interesting to see over time what kind of threads are pulled in Russia, because at the end of the day, the people who are worse off here, other than the Ukrainians, are the Russian people. Putin has thrown them under the bus. They're going to be international pariahs. Their economy is in shatters for perhaps a decade or more. They become essentially he wanted to create Ukraine as a vassal state, but Russia is becoming a vassal state to China. And so the Russian people at some point here, you hope, will start to get the message that he's not thinking about their health and happiness. He's thinking about himself only.
What about the possibility of this moving beyond the borders of Ukraine? I'm sure you're familiar with all the debate and discussion around whether or not that is ultimately Putin's intention. We've got that kind of warning shot at the military base a couple Sundays ago in the west of Ukraine, not far from the Polish border, a NATO country in that instance. When you're trying to think of or analyze what the answer to that question is, what kind of factors do you look to? Well,
I mean, dictators don't stop until they are stopped. And President Biden said it in the State of the Union message, last week, that, when their dictators are not held to account, they continue to create chaos. And so, I think his military is doing so poorly here that there's not an immediate threat that he's going to want to take on NATO, even though he may use that as a threat to tell his people that NATO is threatening him. But I do think it's true that, every time he sees what he views as weakness, he tries to take advantage of it. And so part of the reason we're in this problem is every time he acted in the past, whether he invaded Georgia or Moldova or took Crimea or Ukraine in the past, we never pushed back effectively and hard enough. And he used threats and intimidation, and we sort of backed off and hoped for the best. And he actually got concessions from these things. And so come this time, there wasn't a lot to push back with him on, and he thought he could get away with it. And he miscalculated terribly. But he's going to have to find a way, to save face for himself.
Okay, Mr. Sipher, I'll leave it there. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's John Sipher. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.